George Saunders is one of our best known contemporary American fiction writers. He's a teacher at Syracuse University. He's published all sorts of books, both novels, works of short fiction, and also a book on writing and on great Russian writing. And his most famous book, probably in the past decade, is Lincoln in the Bardo, which is the story of, and this was published in 2017. This is the story of the death of Willie Lincoln, who was the youngest of President Abraham Lincoln's children. Lincoln had 4 sons, and 3 of them died before maturity. Only 1 son lived into adulthood, and most of these children died during the presidency of Mr. Lincoln. This is an experimental sort of novel, and we'll get to why it would be called experimental later on. This is historical fiction. It all takes place over the course of one night, more or less, during the burial, during the ceremony to bury Willie Lincoln. The term Bardo is a Tibetan Buddhist term, as far as I know. Like most folks who in the West who grew up Christian and who have sort of faded away from that, Buddhism has been an interest of mine as I sort of get to explore spirituality beyond the traditional Christian way. And this term of Bardo just means a place in between. So life as we know it now is a Bardo between birth and death. The Bardo that Willie Lincoln is experiencing is the Bardo between life and death. So Lincoln passes. Willie Lincoln passes after a long sickness, after a very violent, excruciating sickness, and you have to remember that this was just a small boy. And you know, it's one thing for an older person to get sick and to struggle and to pass, but it's a complete other thing for a small child to become really sick, and to be a parent enduring that and having to watch that child fade away. So there's parts of this book that are just excruciating, in terms of this small boy fading, of him succumbing to this illness. Most of the book takes place over the course of that one day. The Bardo takes form in the cemetery where Lincoln is to be buried in Washington, D.C., and it's filled with all sorts of trapped souls who refuse to acknowledge that they themselves have died. So it's a very metaphysical ordeal. Many of them don't know how long they've been there. They don't know why they're there. They refer to their coffins as sick boxes. They think that they're just in this sort of sickness that they will soon overcome. But of course, all along the reader knows that they have died and that they are not quite ready to pass on to the next realm. As this story goes along, and as these trapped souls help Willie Lincoln accumulate to this new strange landscape that he has arrived at, President Lincoln is seen multiple times throughout the story returning to the cemetery long after people have gone, long after the mourners have went away. You have to remember that this was a time when the president could go for a walk, could leave the White House, stroll Washington unmolested. And so Lincoln sneaks out of his official duties and goes off to the cemetery to spend time with the corpse of his now deceased son. And the son that we are able to see, the spirit of of Willie Lincoln, is not able to communicate with the president. So there's many scenes where the spirit of this young boy is trying to communicate with his father beyond the grave, and where President Lincoln is viewing the body of this recently deceased son, seemingly trying to will it to live, trying to bring it back. And the grief and the tenderness in these moments are just so masterfully written and so beautiful, terrifying and sad at the same time. The structure of this novel is interesting. A lot of it is fragmented flows of consciousness from the trapped souls from Willie Lincoln, but some of it is clippings from books, from newspapers of the time, from historical references, and it sort of is this fragmented narrative across the board that comes together in a mosaic form and creates this really, really compelling piece of fiction. And I want to read just a few of those to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. The first one is from a book, and I may be pronouncing this word wrong. I believe it's In Reveille in Washington, 1860 to 1865. This is a book by Margaret Leach. One of the things that you got to understand about the time is that President Lincoln was married to Mrs. Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln. And Mrs. Lincoln liked to have guests to the White House and liked to throw a party and liked the White House to be a place of luxury, a place that is well decorated, a place where foreign leaders would come and be very impressed. And this obviously didn't play well. Why? Well, because there was a great civil war happening. Young men from all across the country were being sent to their deaths by this man, President Lincoln, and he and his wife were having parties at the White House still. Even in a day where you could get away with a lot more, this did not play well at all. Rivals in Washington were more than willing to have this link to the press, and eventually to the people. So here's just a snippet from that. It says, abolitionists criticized the merrymaking at the White House, and many declined to attend. Ben Wade's regrets were said to have been harshly worded. Are the President and Mrs. Lincoln aware that there is a civil war? If they are not, Mr. and Mrs. Wade are, and for that reason decline to participate in the feasting and the dancing. Again, a massive war is ensuing. And that not only means deaths of young men, it means money going out of the coffers of the government. When you live in the White House, everything you do is funded by the people. And so when you're funding a war and deciding to have huge parties and receptions and balls in the White House, you have to understand that politically that's not going to play well. Another clipping from the same chapter, and that's from chapter 2. This is from In 20 Days by Dorothy Meserve Coonhart and Philip B. Coonhart Jr. And you see the transition happen here from the ball going on at the White House. Willie was burning with fever on the night of the 5th. As his mother dressed for the party, he drew every breath with difficulty. She could see that his lungs were congested, and she was frightened. So very early on in this book, the scene is being set. The Lincolns are throwing a party. Their small boy cannot attend because he's feeling sick. All under the backdrop of this great war happening in the South. And you have to understand that most of the war was happening not far from Washington. On page 293, we've reached we have reached the death of young Willie Lincoln. And so there's been a procession. They've reached the cemetery, and the funeral has happened, and the boy has been placed in his tomb. And this is a clipping from in private correspondence of Mr. Samuel Pierce by permission of his estate. It says, the president turned away from the coffin. It appeared by a sheer act of will. And it occurred to me how hard it must be for the man to leave his child behind in a place of such gloom and loneliness, which never, when responsible for a living child, he would have done. So that's the president at the time saying his last goodbye. We know as the reader of this book, that he comes back and tries to commune with the child, tries to be with the child on further occasions. It's one of the things that makes Abe Lincoln not only one of our better presidents, but one of our more fascinating figures in our history, is the overwhelming sadness and the just terrible things that happened to him throughout his life. And he was able to overcome and to become this great figure. His legacy is debated on valid points. He pulled great power into the seat of the presidency. He killed many. His actions were responsible for the deaths of many. But this was an individual who took control in a time of great peril. And in this book, what Saunders does is shows him in a vulnerable moment. Takes a great man and shows him in a vulnerable, terrible moment. So that is Lincoln in the Bardo. I would highly suggest it. It takes a little bit getting used to because it is very fragmented. You feel like you're stopping and starting all the time. But it is well worth the read.